Today, I want to share with you a story about a single father who never asked for a second chance and a woman who never believed she deserved one. It begins on a cold December evening in a small western town where winter settled over the rooftops like a heavy, unspoken truth. Jonah Mercer stood alone near the back wall of the community hall, keeping to the shadows the way a man does when he's forgotten how to belong. He was 42, broad-shouldered but tired around the edges, a widowed father raising his boy the best he knew how. The December harvest social swirled with laughter and clatter, families greeting families, neighbors swapping stories of blizzards and cattle prices. But those sounds never quite reached Jonah. His 8-year-old son, Elias, sat on a bench beside him, quietly sketching horses in a worn notebook. That child could draw a running mare with more life than most grown men could speak into words. Jonah watched him for a long moment, grateful for the boy's quiet company. They had become a small island together, just the two of them, ever since the day illness took Jonah's wife and left their home echoing with absence. Around them, the room glowed with oil lamps and pine garlands. But for Jonah and Elias, it felt more like a place they were visiting rather than a place they belonged. And then she entered. Lydia Rowan stepped into the hall like someone bracing against a storm, pale, exhausted, clutching her coat tightly around her. She might have gone unnoticed if not for those eyes blue as a winter sky, restless as wind over snow. She was 36, far too young to look so worn, yet carrying the heavy silence of a woman who'd been talked about more than she'd ever been spoken to. Her husband had run off the year before California. They said, chasing opportunity. They said, but everyone in town had their own private version of the story. And none of those versions were kind to her. Lydia moved carefully through the crowd, keeping her chin lifted just enough to look strong, but not enough to hide the tremble in her hands. Jonah noticed her long before she noticed him. Maybe it was the way she scanned the room like someone searching for a lifeline. Maybe it was simply that loneliness recognizes loneliness. She caught sight of him in that quiet corner and paused, gathering her courage as if it cost something heavy. Then she walked toward him. Mr. Mercer, she whispered, breath clouding the cold air between them. Could I speak with you a moment? Her voice cracked just enough for Jonah to nod without hesitation. He stood straighter, motioned her toward a quieter corner behind the coat rack, where the smell of pine and wool filled the air. Elias looked up briefly, curious but calm, as Lydia's little girl, Hazel, 7 years old, small for her age, with a ribbon slipping out of her tangled hair, peeked shyly from behind her mother's skirts. Jonah waited, watching the tremble in Lydia's fingers as she pressed them together. Whatever she needed to say, it wasn't easy. I wouldn't ask this unless I had nowhere else to turn. She began softly, her voice a fragile thread. Hazel has her Christmas program next week. All the children's fathers will stand with them. Except mine won't. And she's already been whispered about enough. She swallowed, blinking rapidly. She asked me yesterday why the other children had fathers and she didn't. I told her she wasn't alone. But she is. And Lydia's voice broke. I can't bear to see her hurt anymore. Jonah felt something sink in his chest. He knew that ache too well, that helplessness a parent feels when their child asks a question the world has no kind answer to. What are you asking? Lydia, he said quietly. She took a breath that shook. I'm asking if you would pretend to be her father. Just until Christmas. Just enough so she can stand on that stage and feel like she belongs. Just enough so the town will let her breathe. Jonah stared at her, stunned. Pretend to be another man. Step into a place abandoned recklessly by the husband who'd vanished. Everything in him recoiled. Not from her, but from the wound she was asking him to reopen. He knew the cost of pretending. He knew how easily a child could attach hope to the wrong thing. And he knew he'd promised himself never to fill a space he couldn't stay in. No one else will ask you, Lydia whispered. And I know I have no right. But Hazel deserves one Christmas without being pitied. Jonah didn't answer. He looked down instead at Hazel's wide, hopeful eyes, at Elias's small hand paused over his sketchbook. And in Elias's gaze, he saw something unexpected. Hope, not just curiosity, not confusion, hope. Elias stared at Hazel the way a boy looks at a child who might become a friend. Someone who understood quiet. Someone who understood loss. Jonah's throat tightened. Lydia mistook his silence for refusal. She stepped back, smoothing her coat with trembling hands. I'm sorry, she murmured. It was unfair. Please forget Lydia, Jonah said gently. She stopped. He drew a long breath, one that seemed to pull winter straight into his chest. Just for Christmas, he said. Her chin quivered. Hazel's face broke into a shy, radiant smile. Even Elias looked up, baffled but glad. For the first time in a long while, warmth settled into Jonah's voice as he added, We'll make sure she has a good season. Lydia pressed her lips together, holding back tears. Thank you, she whispered. You don't know what this means. But Jonah did know, or at least, he had a feeling he was about to find out. And that is where our story truly begins, with one desperate request, one reluctant promise, and two families who had no idea that Christmas was about to change everything. When Jonah Mercer agreed to pretend just for Christmas, he imagined something small, manageable, a handshake arrangement, a kindness returned. Then life would slip back into its careful, lonely shape. But life rarely follows the shapes we draw for it. A day after the harvest social, Jonah and his son Elias made their way to Lydia Rowan's cabin. Snowflakes drifted around them like soft ashes from the sky. Jonah kept telling himself this was simply doing right by a neighbor. Nothing more. Nothing dangerous. Nothing lasting. Still, his heart thudded strangely when Lydia opened the door. Her cabin smelled of wood smoke and something gentler like cinnamon left in a drawer too long. It was a clean home, but you could sense the quiet sadness in the corners. The kind that comes from two people trying their best to make a life from the scraps they were left with. Hazel peeked out from behind her mother, ribbon crooked in her hair. Elias gave her a small, shy smile, the kind only another quiet child would understand. And Hazel, soft as a whisper, smiled back. Come in, Lydia said, stepping aside. Her voice was steady. But Jonah didn't miss the way she wrung her hands. Jonah stepped inside, removing his hat. Elias stayed close until Hazel reached for him. Want to see my drawings? She asked. Elias nodded, and the two slipped toward the hearth, where a small basket of crayons waited on the floor. Jonah watched them settle side by side, heads bent together like two little birds on a branch. Their laughter, small at first, began to warm the room. Lydia saw it too. Something eased in her shoulders. I didn't think they'd take to each other so quickly, she murmured. Children know what they need, Jonah replied. Sometimes quicker than grown folks do. Lydia didn't argue. She just led him to the small table near the window and poured him coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Jonah noticed. He wished he didn't. They sat for a quiet moment, each listening to the children. Hazel giggled as Elias showed her how to draw a galloping horse. Then Elias laughed as Hazel taught him how to braid a bit of yarn. It was astonishing, two lonely children creating comfort like they'd practiced it their whole lives. Lydia folded her hands tightly in front of her. We should talk about expectations, she said, sounding almost embarrassed. Jonah nodded. Fair enough. She took a breath, steadying herself as if she were signing a contract with God himself. There are 3 things I need. Hazel's Christmas program next Friday, the Christmas Eve service, and, her voice thinned, maybe one Sunday meal, so other families see us together. Jonah listened. Her requests weren't extravagant. They weren't even unreasonable. They were simply the requests of a woman trying to shield her child from the world for the briefest moment. That's all. She finished quickly. Nothing more. I don't expect anything beyond that. Jonah studied her face. The strain there, the pride, the fear of asking too much. He knew that fear all too well. All right, he said softly. We'll do that. Lydia exhaled with relief. But something flickered in her eyes, something that said she'd hoped for more than just his agreement. Jonah pretended not to notice. It felt safer that way. When the coffee was gone and the cold began creeping toward the windows, the children asked if they could decorate the tree. Lydia hesitated. I haven't had the heart to put it up yet. Hazel's expression fell, and Jonah saw the way Lydia winced at her daughter's disappointment. How about we help? Jonah offered. I've got some ornaments at home. Been sitting in a box for 2 years. Might do 'em good to shine again. Lydia's eyes softened. You don't have to. Sometimes. Jonah interrupted gently. People need help. They don't feel right asking for. Lydia swallowed hard. She nodded. An hour later, Jonah returned with a small wooden crate, the same crate he'd carried down from his attic a dozen times, only to push back into the dark again. Ornaments his wife had loved. Hand-carved stars. Little horses Elias had painted as a toddler. A bell that still carried the sound of a Christmas long gone. He set the crate down by the tree while Lydia plugged in the oil lamp. Elias and Hazel knelt eagerly, one by one. Jonah lifted the ornaments, dusting them off with his thumb. Hazel's face lit up at every piece, like she was holding treasure. Can I hang this one? She asked, holding a wooden angel. Course you can, Jonah said, warmth stealing into his voice. He lifted her so she could reach a higher branch. Her little arms steadied around his neck. Thank you, Papa, Hazel whispered. The word slipped out so naturally it hung in the air before anyone could catch it. Lydia froze. Jonah felt something inside him twist, sharp and tender all at once. Hazel realized what she'd said and quickly pulled back, eyes wide with embarrassment. I mean, Mr. Mercer, she stammered. Jonah touched her shoulder gently. It's all right, sweetheart. Anyone can make a mistake. But was it a mistake? Or was it a longing so deep a child couldn't hide it? Lydia's eyes shone not from joy, but from fear that she'd asked too much of a man who'd already buried so much. Jonah set Hazel gently down and stood there for a moment, holding an ornament shaped like a star. His wife had carved it years ago. He swallowed hard, feeling time fold strangely inside his chest. He hung the star on a branch close to the top. It looks right there, Lydia said quietly. Jonah nodded. Yeah, it does. The cabin, once filled with quiet sadness, felt different then, lighter, warmer, almost safe. For the first time in a long while, Jonah realized he wasn't simply doing a kind deed for a neighbor. He was stepping into a space his heart wasn't sure it was ready for. And yet, something in that small cabin whispered that maybe, just maybe. He'd been walking toward this moment for far longer than he understood. As the afternoon settled into early winter dusk, Jonah and Lydia's quiet cabin began to glow with lamplight and the soft hum of children's laughter. The tree stood half-decorated, ribbons spilling across the floor, ornaments gleaming in little piles when the world outside shifted. A hard, abrupt knock cut through the warmth like a cold blade. Lydia stiffened. Jonah glanced toward the door, his jaw tightening in a way that said he already knew who stood on the other side. And when Lydia opened it, her breath caught. There she was, Mrs. Myrtle Cottle, a woman who believed gossip was a God-given duty, keeper of moral opinion, self-appointed guardian of the town's virtue. Her face pinched tighter than winter bark, her thin lips trembling with disapproval she was eager, almost hungry to release. "Lydia Rowan," she began, her voice sharp enough to chip ice. "Imagine my surprise seeing Mr. Mercer's wagon outside your home this late in the day." Her gaze swept the doorway like a searchlight, then shifted inside, straight to where Jonah stood beside the half-decorated tree, Elias and Hazel at his feet. The look that settled over Mrs. Cottle's face was colder than the wind that howled outside. "Well," she said, "isn't this cozy?" Lydia's cheeks flamed red. "Mrs. Cottle, it's not." Jonah stepped forward before she could finish. His voice was calm, even, but carried the weight of a man who'd grown tired of letting others write the truth for him. "I'm helping a neighbor prepare her Christmas tree," he said. "Didn't realize charity required your permission." Mrs. Cottle bristled. "Charity is one thing, but appearances. Jonah interrupted softly, "are often wrong." Lydia blinked, startled by the firmness in his tone. No one had spoken up for her like that since the day her husband left her standing in the dust with a child in her arms. Mrs. Cottle, flustered, straightened her shawl. "I'll have you know, the town is watching. Then they can watch." Jonah said simply. The woman opened her mouth to fire back, but something in Jonah's steady gaze stopped her. She sniffed sharply instead, muttered a few disjointed words about Christian propriety, and hustled back into the wind, letting the door close behind her with a startled thump. Lydia let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for a year. Jonah watched her for a quiet moment before turning back toward the tree. But Lydia stepped closer. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Sure I did," Jonah replied. "Sometimes good people need someone to stand between them and the cold." She swallowed hard. And for a moment, just a moment, Jonah saw the woman beneath the exhaustion and the guilt the town had wrapped around her. A woman fighting every day to stay strong for her daughter, even while her own heart was fraying at the edges. "Thank you," she murmured. Jonah nodded and returned to the children. Hazel tugged his sleeve, wanting help placing another ornament. Elias proudly showed Lydia the picture he and Hazel had drawn together, and yet something had shifted, an invisible thread pulling the adults closer, even as they tried not to notice. Later, when the children wandered off to braid yarn bracelets and whisper secrets the way new friends do, Lydia found Jonah in the kitchen, washing his hands at the basin. She stepped beside him, reaching for a towel. Their hands brushed. It was the smallest touch, light as the flicker of the oil lamp, but it sent something rippling between them. A quiet shock neither had prepared for. Lydia pulled her hand back quickly, but not before Jonah noticed the way her breath hitched. "Sorry," she murmured. Nothing to be sorry for. Jonah replied gently. The kitchen grew still. The soft crackle of the stove, the muffled giggles from the living room, the faint tinkling of ornaments shifting on the tree, it all wove a kind of quiet intimacy around them. Lydia leaned against the counter, watching Jonah as he dried his hands. There was something different in her gaze now, something softer and afraid at the same time. It's been a long time since anyone stood up for me, she said. For us, Jonah nodded. Some folks forget kindness doesn't cost more than cruelty. She smiled faintly. Cruelty seems cheaper to them. Jonah looked down, then back up straight into her eyes. It's not. It always costs somebody something. The air between them warmed. Even as frost glimmered outside the window, Lydia took a breath. This arrangement, it means more than I can say. But I don't want you thinking I expect anything beyond what we agreed. Jonah nodded slowly. I know, but he wasn't sure he believed himself anymore. Lydia's hand drifted to a teacup, fingers tapping nervously. She didn't know how to speak the truth clawing at her heart. That she had forgotten what it felt like to have a man stand beside her. That Jonah's presence in her home didn't feel like charity at all. It felt like a door opening to a warmth she hadn't dared to let in. As for Jonah, he didn't know how to tell her that seeing her fight through every day with grace and grit stirred something deep in him, something that looked an awful lot like longing. Neither spoke further. Neither needed to. Sometimes a spark doesn't need air to burn. Sometimes it only needs two wounded souls standing close enough to feel the warmth rising between them. Outside, winter pressed against the windows. Inside, something fragile and dangerously real had begun to take root. The week slipped by in a hush of falling snow and whispered anticipation. The closer Christmas crept, the more the little town stirred. Lanterns hung in windows. Wreaths appeared on gates, and children hurried through the streets with paper angels and script pages crumpled in their hands. And on Friday evening, the schoolhouse, usually a drafty, quiet place, buzzed like a kicked beehive. The benches overflowed with parents bundled in winter coats, talking loud enough to cover their nervous pride. The stove in the corner crackled with heat that never quite reached the far wall. Costume wings rustled. Shepherd staffs clattered to the ground. The air was thick with excitement, exhaustion, and the unmistakable smell of wet wool. Jonah Mercer had never seen so many families packed into one room. He stood near the aisle beside Lydia. Children pressed between them like a little cluster of hope. Hazel wore a too-big shepherd robe that trailed at her heels, and Elias held her hand like a steady anchor. Jonah felt out of place, but not as sharply as he used to. Maybe it was the way Elias leaned into him, or the way Hazel kept turning to make sure Jonah was still there. Maybe it was the way Lydia's shoulder brushed his every now and then, accidental, fleeting, but real. The teacher, Mrs. Whitcomb, clapped her hands with an authority she had likely perfected over the course of 30 years. Children places. Please, let's take it from the beginning. Hazel's small fingers tightened around Elias's, her face pale, her breath shallow. Lydia noticed instantly. Mothers always notice first. You all right? Sweetheart, she whispered, smoothing Hazel's hair. Hazel nodded, but it was the nod of someone trying to be brave too quickly. When her turn came, Hazel stepped onto the makeshift stage, a few boards set across crates. She clutched her shepherd's staff like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The other children murmured their lines, some too loud, some forgetting altogether. Parents smiled indulgently. It was the sort of chaos everyone expected from a Christmas pageant rehearsal. But when Hazel's moment arrived, The room hushed. She was supposed to say only one line, "We have seen the star," and followed it here. Short, simple, practiced 100 times in her little bedroom. But the moment she looked out at the crowd, at all the eyes, at all the faces, her mouth opened, and no sound came with. She froze. Completely. Her eyes widened, darting between the expectant faces, then toward Lydia, who rose halfway from her seat. Helpless and aching, Hazel turned next toward Jonah. She didn't look at him like a pretend father. She looked at him like the only steady thing in a world that suddenly tilted sideways. Jonah felt it hit him deep. Something in his chest tightened, something old. Something he thought grief had carved out forever. Before he even realized he was moving, Jonah stepped into the aisle. Softly, calmly. The hush deepened as people turned to watch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Hazel," he said gently, "you remember what I told Elias?" The girl blinked, tears trembling at the edges of her lashes. Jonah smiled small. "Warm, steady as a lighthouse. Bravery ain't the lack of fear, sweetheart," he said. "It's walkin' right through it." A ripple moved through the room, an audible exhale. A recognition. Something in Jonah's voice had weight. Truth. A kind of father wisdom even those who didn't know him could feel deep in their bones. Hazel took a breath. A trembling one, but a breath nonetheless. She lifted her chin just enough and said clearly, "Fragile but brave. We have seen the star and followed it here." The room erupted into applause. Real applause. Not indulgent. Not patronizing. Proud applause. Lydia pressed a hand to her mouth, trying not to cry. Elias bounced on his toes, cheering for the girl he'd claimed as a friend the moment he met her. Hazel's face, flushed with relief, broke into a small, glowing smile. She looked again at Jonah, not at the crowd. Not at her mother, at Jonah. Her eyes sparkled with something simple and devastating. Trust. And that trust landed right in Jonah's chest like a warm coal. After rehearsal, the schoolhouse emptied slowly. Families gathering coats and brushing hay from their children's costumes. Jonah lingered by the back wall with Lydia while the children played with leftover props. Lydia turned to him, and their eyes met. That look lasted too long. It wasn't the look of gratitude anymore, or formality, or obligation. It was too honest, too open, too full of the things neither of them were ready to speak. The ache of two lonely people who hadn't meant to find solace in each other, but had. Jonah cleared his throat, breaking the moment. Lydia looked away first, her breath catching slightly. "You saved her tonight," she murmured. Jonah shook his head. She saved herself. She just needed a voice to remind her of it. Lydia's eyes softened, warming in a way that made Jonah want to look away and look closer all at once. "Still," she whispered, "thank you." The children ran back to them then, Hazel waving her staff proudly, Elias clutching his drawing like a prize, and the spell broke, replaced by laughter and small hands tugging at their coats. But the memory of that look, that long, quiet, dangerous look, lingered between Jonah and Lydia like the echo of a promise neither of them had spoken aloud. Outside, the snow deepened. Inside their hearts, something else did too. Sunday dawned cold and gray, the kind of morning that felt carved out of stone. Snow clung to rooftops, and the world seemed wrapped in a frost-quiet stillness as families made their way to the little church at the top of Willow Ridge. Jonah, Lydia, Elias and Hazel walked together, the children chattering softly while the adults kept a polite, careful distance between them. The night before had been full of laughter and warmth, but morning light has a way of revealing the cracks we hoped were hidden. Inside the church, lanterns flickered along the walls. The pews filled quickly, and people's whispers felt sharper than usual, as if the whole town had arrived hungry for something to talk about. Mrs. Myrtle Cottle sat near the front, her back stiff, her hat adorned with frost-tipped feathers. Her eyes slid toward Lydia the moment she entered. A thin smile tugged at the older woman's mouth. Lydia felt the stare like a brand pressed against her skin. Pastor Callum stepped to the pulpit, his voice solemn. He was a good man most days, gentle even, but he was also a man who listened too closely to those who liked to stir the pot. His sermon began harmlessly enough about honesty, about keeping one's word, about the importance of truth during the Christmas season, but then his tone shifted. And we must guard ourselves, he said, voice gaining weight, against deceptions in the eyes of God, against falsehoods that may appear harmless, even charitable, yet lead others astray. The words fell over the congregation like icy pellets. Lydia felt them strike, one by one. Her hands trembled in her lap. Hazel sat pressed against her side, not understanding the meaning but sensing the tension. Mrs. Cottle didn't turn her head, but a small, satisfied smile crept across her face. She had sown her seeds well. Jonah's jaw tightened. He looked at Lydia, saw the way her shoulders curved inward, saw her flinch at words that hadn't said her name but aimed straight at her heart. He leaned slightly toward her. "Don't listen to this," he murmured, but Lydia couldn't help it. The shame crawled into her chest, settling there like a stone. When the final hymn ended and the congregation began drifting toward the door, Lydia could hardly breathe. She stood quickly, trying to avoid attention, but Mrs. Cottle moved with startling swiftness, blocking her path before she made it 3 steps down the aisle. "Lydia Rowan," she said, her voice dipped in honey but sharp as glass. "We need to speak." Lydia stiffened. Jonah stepped instinctively closer, but Mrs. Cottle raised a finger toward him. "This is between women," she snapped, then smiled sweetly, "though I suppose you wouldn't mind hearing it. Mr. Mercer, it concerns you." Jonah's eyes narrowed, but he stayed silent for now. Mrs. Cottle turned her attention back to Lydia. "I know what you're doing," she said, "parading this man around as if he were your husband." Lydia's cheeks blazed red. "That's not, oh, don't bother denying it." Mrs. Cottle sniffed. "You're using him, using his good name, his reputation, all to drag your poor child back into society's favor. It's shameless." Lydia's lips trembled. Hazel just wanted a father she does not have. Mrs. Cottle finished sharply. "And you wanted the town to stop pitying you. But a lie is a lie, dear, even wrapped in Christmas ribbons." Jonah stepped forward then, voice firm. "Mrs. Cottle," but Lydia raised a hand, stopping him. Her eyes glistened. Her voice shook. "Please," she whispered, Don't defend me anymore." Jonah's breath caught. Surprised by her tone, Lydia faced Mrs. Cottle with a fragile dignity. "I never meant to deceive anyone. I just wanted Hazel to feel normal, to have one holiday without shame." Mrs. Cottle gave a cold, triumphant smile. "And now you've ruined Mr. Mercer's good standing. The whole town will talk." That did it. Lydia's composure crumbled. She turned to Jonah, tears spilling freely now. "You should go," she whispered. "Before this gets worse. Before they drag you down because of me?" Jonah stepped closer. "Lydia, no," she said, voice breaking. "This was a mistake. I'm a mistake. I can't let you lose everything you've rebuilt just because I was desperate enough to ask for help." Her breath hitched, her shoulders shaking. "Please leave." "Jonah, please." Elias, standing beside him, looked from Lydia to his father with wide, frightened eyes. Hazel began to cry, clinging to her mother's skirt, confused and terrified. Jonah stood frozen, torn between the instinct to protect and the pain of being pushed away by the very person he was trying to help. Mrs. Cottle waited, expectant, savoring every second. Jonah swallowed hard, then knelt to Elias's height. "Come on, son," he said quietly. Elias blinked up at him, panic rising. "But Hazel, we'll talk later," Jonah whispered. He stood, touched Lydia's trembling arm gently, one last reassurance, but she pulled away, as if she couldn't bear to receive comfort she believed she didn't deserve. Jonah's chest ached, truly ached, and then he turned. He walked toward the door slowly, each step heavy. Snow drifted in through the cracked entrance, cold wind brushing past him as if to accompany his departure. Elias looked back one last time and saw Hazel crying in her mother's arms, her little face crumpled with heartbreak. And he saw his father strong, steady Jonah Mercer walk out into the winter storm, looking like a man being torn in two. Outside, the cold swallowed them, and the church door shut behind them with a hollow thud. Inside, the children sobbed. Outside, Jonah's heart cracked clean open, and winter, deep and merciless, settled between four souls who had begun to believe just barely that they might belong to one another. Snow fell heavier that evening, thick enough to blur the outlines of houses and fences, thick enough to make even familiar roads feel foreign. Jonah walked through it without seeing much at all. His boots sank into drifts that came up to his ankles, and the wind stung his face. But he barely felt any of it. Pain can numb a man faster than cold ever will. Behind him, he left Lydia's trembling voice, Hazel's sobs, Elias's confusion, and Mrs. Cottle's poison curling through the air like smoke. But none of that was what hurt him most. What hurt was the look on Lydia's face as she begged him to leave. A look torn between shame and fear, a woman so used to being blamed that she believed she was poison to anyone who came near. Jonah didn't blame her, but he couldn't stay there, not while his heart twisted in ways he didn't understand. So he walked. He kept walking until the church was a dim shadow behind him and the snow swallowed his tracks. He didn't even realize where his feet were taking him until he reached the far end of the ridge, where the wind whistled low between iron gates. The cemetery. He paused at the entrance, breath clouding the cold air. Part of him wanted to turn around. Another part, the deeper, lonelier part, knew he needed to be here. He pushed open the gate, and it groaned softly, like it remembered him. Jonah walked the familiar path, snow crunching beneath each step. The headstones rose like silent sentinels, draped in soft white. And there, beneath the old cedar tree, was the place he had been avoiding for months. Sarah Mercer, beloved wife, cherished mother, light of our lives. Jonah swallowed hard. He brushed the snow off the stone with the side of his glove. revealing the carved letters. His breath hitched the way it always did when he read her name, like love and loss collided in his chest all over again. He knelt slowly, knees sinking into the icy ground. For a long time, he didn't speak, just looked at the stone as though waiting for it to speak first. The wind rustled the cedar branches, sending flakes drifting around him like quiet benedictions. Finally, Jonah exhaled. I didn't know where else to go. His voice cracked, rough from cold and emotion. I'm making a mess of things again, Sarah, and I don't know if it's wrong or if it's something you'd want for us. He closed his eyes. You were the only one I ever loved, the only one I ever promised the whole world to. And when you left, his breath trembled. When you left, I thought maybe that meant I wasn't meant to love again, that I was done, that my heart had given all it had to give. Snow settled softly on his coat sleeves, but then he paused, shaking his head as though saying the woman's name out loud would be too revealing. Then I met someone who weren't trying to replace you. Someone who's just fightin' to keep her little girl from hurtin'. Someone lonely. Someone tired. Someone trying to be strong even when the world keeps telling her she ain't. Jonah looked up at the headstone, at Sarah's name, glowing faintly beneath the winter moon. She didn't ask for much. Just kindness. Just help. His voice softened, deepened, and I gave it. Not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because something in me wanted to. His voice thinned to a whisper. And now I don't know if that makes me guilty or human. Wind whispered across the snow. Would you want me to stay lonely? He asked, voice breaking on the last word. Would you want Elias to grow up without laughter in the house, without a mother's tenderness, without a family that feels whole? He bowed his head. Would you want me to love again? Silence answered him gently. But it wasn't empty silence. It was the kind that wraps itself around a wounded heart, not to heal it instantly, but to remind it that healing is possible. The kind that feels like permission. Jonah breathed out, and the breath came steadier. He reached out, touched the cold stone with gloved fingers. You'll always be part of us, he murmured. Nothing will ever change that. But maybe I've been holding on so tight, I forgot the world keeps turning. Forgot our boy needs more than a father who walks around half alive. He rose slowly, brushing snow from his coat. I'll always love you, Sarah, he whispered. But it's time I quit living like the graves got claim on me. The wind eased. The cold didn't bite so sharply now, and the path back looked clearer than the one that brought him here. Jonah stepped from the graveside, feeling something settle in him, resolve, or courage, or maybe the first tiny seed of hope. Home, he realized, wasn't a place. It wasn't walls or roofs, or the memories you buried inside them. Home was the people you chose, the ones you showed up for when the storm got thick. He turned, tightening his coat. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The wind carried no judgment now, only encouragement. Jonah Mercer walked out of the cemetery with his decision carved into his heart like scripture. He walked toward Lydia Rowan's cabin, toward the children who cried for him, toward the woman who feared she wasn't worth standing beside, toward the life he finally realized he still wanted. Not out of obligation, not out of pity, but out of love he hadn't expected to find again. A love he was no longer afraid to claim. Jonah walked through the deepening snow with a resolve he hadn't felt in years. The wind howled down Willow Ridge, but he didn't turn back. Not this time. Every step carried him closer to the truth he had avoided since the night Lydia first asked him for help. He didn't go home, didn't return to his cabin, didn't try to sleep. Instead, his boots found their way to the one place in town still lit after dark, the church. Its doors stood slightly open, a thin line of golden lamplight cutting through the darkness. Jonah hesitated only a moment before slipping inside. The sanctuary was quiet, so quiet he could hear the faint crackle of the lantern near the pulpit. And there, kneeling at the altar rail, was Lydia Rowan. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. One hand gripped the edge of the pew, the other pressed against her mouth to muffle the sound. She looked small, too small for the weight she carried. Jonah's chest tightened. He walked down the aisle slowly, each footstep soft against the wooden floor. Lydia didn't hear him until he was beside her. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red and wet, her face etched with heartbreak she couldn't hide. "Jonah," she whispered, as if speaking his name hurt. "You shouldn't be here." "I should," he answered quietly. "And I am." He lowered himself onto the kneeler beside her. For a long moment, neither spoke. The church around them seemed to breathe in the silence: old wood, soft lamplight, the faint scent of pine garlands. Finally, Lydia drew a shaky breath. "I didn't mean to push you away," she said. I just couldn't bear the thought of ruining your life like I ruined mine." The things Mrs. Cottle said, the sermon, the judgment, it all felt like proof that I've become a burden to anyone who gets too close. Jonah shook his head, voice steady and warm. "You're not a burden, Lydia. Not to me." She looked away, tears welling again. The pretending, it went too far. It stopped feeling like an act, and that scared me. Jonah turned toward her fully. "Stopped feeling like pretending," he echoed softly. "For me too." Her breath caught. Jonah ran a hand over his face, gathering courage. "I came here tonight because I needed to be honest with you. What started as a kindness turned into something real. Somewhere between the tree ornaments and Hazel calling me Papa and you looking at me like I was worth something again, I stopped acting. Lydia." He hesitated, voice rough. "And I think you did too." A tear slipped down Lydia's cheek. "I didn't want it to happen," she whispered. "I didn't want to hope for anything. Hope hurts more when it's taken away. But when you walked out of the church, it felt like I'd lost something I wasn't supposed to want in the first place." Jonah's voice dropped, gentle as falling snow. "Lydia, look at me." She did, slowly, reluctantly, fully. He held her gaze like a vow. "I'm staying," he said. "Not for show, not for the town. For you, for Hazel, for Elias, for the family we've already started being. Whether either of us meant it or not." Her breath trembled. "Jonah, I'm not scared anymore," he said. "And I don't want you to be." Lydia covered her mouth with her hand as if trying to hold back a sob, but she couldn't. The sound broke free, raw, relieved, terrified, grateful all at once. Jonah reached out, hesitating for only a heartbeat, then gathered her into his arms. Their first embrace was unsteady, almost uncertain. But the moment Lydia's forehead pressed against his shoulder, and Jonah's hand found the small of her back, the shakiness softened. Two people who'd been alone far too long finally let themselves lean, not out of desperation, not out of duty, out of truth, out of choice. And for the first time, it felt real. Christmas Eve arrived, dressed in silver clouds and whispering snow. By dusk, Lanterns glowed through frosted windows, and families hurried up the church steps in a flurry of wool coats and whispered curiosity. Everyone knew tonight's service would be different. Everyone felt the tension in the air. Inside, the sanctuary was packed, families squeezing into every pew, breath fogging in the winter chill, gossip humming like distant thunder. Some faces were warm, offering small nods toward Lydia and the children. Others turned away, stiff with judgment. And at the very front, Mrs. Myrtle Cottle sat perched like a raven, practically trembling with anticipation, waiting for Lydia to misstep, waiting for Jonah to falter. Lydia sat close to the aisle, Hazel tucked against her side, Elias beside Jonah, and though the four of them looked like a family, Lydia's hands trembled. She feared tonight would undo everything, that Jonah would protect her heart in private, yet choose safety over scandal in public. The pageant began, as it always did, with crooked halos, drooping angel wings, shepherds losing their staffs, 3 wise men whispering their lines too loudly. Laughter rippled through the room. Then Hazel Rowan stepped onto the stage. The little girl searched the crowd. Nervous fingers curled tightly around her staff. And then she saw him, Jonah Mercer, sitting tall in the flickering candlelight, giving her the smallest nod. Steady and calm, Hazel took a breath and said clearly, bravely, softly shaking the room, "The star brought us home," not the line she had practiced, not the words written on the script, her own. A murmur swept through the sanctuary. Lydia pressed a hand to her heart. Jonah exhaled, pride warming his features. Even Pastor Callum paused, taken by the weight of it. Home. The word hung in the rafters like a blessing. When the pageant ended, Pastor Callum stepped forward, voice gentle now, changed somehow by the little girl's truth. "We invite each household to come forward and light their family candle from the Christ candle," he said. Lydia froze. Her breath shook. She knew Jonah wouldn't stand, not publicly, not with the whole town staring, not with Mrs. Cottle perched like a hawk. But then Jonah rose. He didn't hesitate. He didn't glance around the room. He simply stood, turned to Lydia, and held out his hand. A promise. A question. An answer. Lydia stared at him, heart pounding. Then, slowly, she took his hand. Hazel slipped her small fingers into Jonah's other hand, and Elias moved beside Lydia with quiet certainty, and so they walked 4 silhouettes in warm lamplight toward the altar, toward recognition, toward truth, toward the place where pretending ended forever. Together, Jonah and Lydia held the long matchstick. Together, they touched it to the flame, and together, they lit their family candle while the entire congregation watched in stunned silence. It should have felt frightening, but it didn't. It felt right. Old rancher Harlan Briggs stood suddenly, his voice ringing strong across the pews. "This man's done right. Anyone got a problem can take it up with me." His wife nodded. Others murmured agreement. The room shifted, judgment melting into acceptance, suspicion into respect, and for the first time, Lydia felt the weight of shame lift from her shoulders like snow sliding off a roof. Jonah's hand found the small of her back, steady as always, and the 4 of them walked back to their pew as something new, something real, something whole. The next morning dawned, soft and quiet, snow glittering like crushed diamonds across the valley. Inside Lydia's cabin, the fire crackled gently, warming 4 stockings hanging from the mantel, 2 larger, Too small. Hazel held Jonah's hand. Elias leaned into Lydia. And the children, eyes wide with hope that had survived every storm, asked the question their hearts had already answered. Are we a family now? For real? Lydia turned to Jonah. Jonah turned to Lydia. And something unspoken, something tender and sure, passed between them. For real? Jonah whispered. Then, with a small smile meant only for her, for good, Lydia rested her head on his shoulder. Jonah kissed her hair softly. Outside, snow fell against the cabin. Inside, warmth, belonging, and grace settled over them like a blessing. A single father found the family he didn't know he was still allowed to hope for. And a woman who thought she was beyond saving discovered a home she never dreamed she'd deserve. Thank you for listening to this story. Friends, I'd love to hear what this tale meant to you. Share your thoughts down in the comments and tell us where you're listening from tonight. If this touched your heart, don't forget to like the video. Share it with someone who loves a good Western tale. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story from the frontier. Until next time, may your nights be warm, your roads gentle, and your heart open to second chances.